going after that truck.
How?
I don't know. I'm making this up as I go.
There's one dwarf you won't ensnare so easily. I have the eyes of a hawk and the ears of a fox.
Okay, we're here with John Ris-Davies from Indiana Jones, Lord of the Rings. I'm very excited to talk to him about the release of Indiana Jones on Blu-ray in Australia. So first of all, John, very nice to meet you, and thanks for your time.
Well, thank you for being so patient.
No worries, man. The first question that obviously I have to ask you is how you feel about being in Australia promoting such an iconic saga like Indiana Jones.
Well, there are two questions there, aren't there? First of all, do I like being in Australia? I love Australia. A great, great country, Australia, and a great people, and love coming to see you, and wish I could spend more time here. As for Indiana Jones and that whole, those 4 films, it's a great pleasure to be still a part of them. I always tell young actors, it is not enough just to make a movie. You must help sell it as well. I didn't quite realize that 30 years later I'd still be trying to sell the darn picture. It is an extraordinary film. I'm talking now about the first one, but many of the remarks would apply to the others as well. It is extraordinary, isn't it, that 30 years later we should still be interested in a particular film. It isn't, to my mind, it isn't as great or as iconic, for instance, as Casablanca. It isn't as profound, perhaps, as Casablanca. And yet, I growingly believe that it is one of the great pictures of the latter half of the 20th century. I was at a fan convention in Toronto about 3 weeks ago, and I met 2 separate families. Grandfather had seen Raiders of the Lost Ark in the cinema, and when his son was the right age, about 10, he sat him down and showed him, you know, the VHS of Raiders of the Lost Ark. Now that son is old enough to be a father himself, and grandfather and father sat the son down and said, right, we're going to show you one of the great pictures. And all 3 in those generations came to meet me in Toronto.
That's amazing, really amazing.
It is extraordinary. So it's actually jumping. It's moving from generation to generation.
Mm-hmm. It's timeless film.
Yeah,
why it's timeless. And speaking about that, how did you react the first time you read the script from Raiders of the Lost Ark? Do you have any concerns or something about that?
I'd never read a script like it. My agent called me up and he said, "What do you think?" And I said, "Well, I've never read a script like this. It is either going to be one of the greatest disasters of all time, or it might just set a new fashion in filmmaking." I said, there's not much dialogue in the script. There's an awful lot of scene description, and the scene description is moving so quickly and jumping. I said, whatever, I'd love to do it just to see what happens. So it was a great experience, really.
And it's something you will never regret, for sure.
No.
So, you got the script, you got the role. What was the first scene that you shot on Raiders?
The first scene that I shot in the film is actually my last scene in the film. I turned up on the dockside in La Rochelle, which is in France, as you know, to say a sorrowful goodbye, quote, to Indian Marion from Cairo docks. I got there was no dialogue in the scene, and Spielberg was sitting down and he was typing. And I looked over his shoulder and said, "What are you typing?" And he said, "Your words." And I looked at it and said, "Well, isn't he more likely to have said da 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 da? And he went, all right, da 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 da. There you are. Now your character, when he's high or happy, he bursts into Gilbert and Sullivan at the end. So try and incorporate that at the end of the scene. So that's how that scene started.
Okay. And speaking about working with Spielberg, you also were involved directly in this with George Lucas was in charge of the script, but you also work with Peter Jackson, another visionary filmmaker. What would you say is the difference between those experiences?
Well, the differences are those of, these are great filmmakers. These are mega great filmmakers. What distinguishes Peter Jackson from the other two is they grew up, George and Stephen grew up in Hollywood where there was an established film industry. The unique characteristic of Peter Jackson is that he built a film industry from scratch in New Zealand to service this film. I did not believe when I went to do Lord of the Rings that he had a hope in hell. The books are essentially unfilmable. Tolkien himself sold the film rights for about £110 because he owed the Inland Revenue money, and he didn't think they could be made into films. The one attempt that had been made to turn them into films had been catastrophic anyway. This man had made 4 or 5 very good films, but very small films. I had been around some pretty big projects. When we did Law, War and Remembrance, for instance, it was 18 months of principal photography all around the world. And I know what happens when you've got that measure of time. If something goes wrong and you are not prepared for it, costs can easily run out of control. And I did not believe that Peter Jackson understood this. I believed that Peter Jackson was a young and competent filmmaker of small films who was just going to get so out of his depth. And I spent the first... In truth, I didn't want to play the part. I got offered Gimli and I did not want to play the part. I said, look, I've spent 30 years as an actor trying to be recognized. Why would I want to cover myself in a prosthetic makeup? Added to which, I don't want to spend hours a day in makeup. My manager lied to me and she said, oh, they promised me they'll get it down to about an hour. I laughed at her because you can't do that in an hour. I knew that was it. My then agent said, John, if you turn down this part, I don't think we can continue to represent you, which is a bit of a tough one. But the deciding factor was really my eldest son, my elder son, should I say, who said, Dad, if you turn this down, frankly, I think you'll be nuts. And I said, why? He said, well, when you think about it, in every bookshop throughout the world, there's about 2 feet of book space devoted to Tolkien. Think of what that means as a fan basis. And I thought about it, and I realized, of course, he was right. But I still didn't believe, when I got to New Zealand, that there was a hope in heck of this happening. And I don't, I know they were talking about 14 months of principal photography. You know that that's going to be a lot more than that. I didn't really want to waste 3 years of my life doing something that, would be instantly ignored. So I accepted, but not in good grace, really. I was going to check out, confirm my suspicion that the guy was on a losing streak. He just didn't understand what he was doing. And then I would have gone to him and I would have said, Peter, look, I'm terribly sorry. I can't really leave my family because I had a wife who was, getting worse and worse and suffered from dementia. I can't really leave my family that long. And he would have had to let me go, because you can't do a project like that unless everyone is marching in the same direction to the beat of the same drum. So I spent 2 weeks there checking out what was happening. I went into every department to make sure that they were just not competent enough to do this. And to my distress, every department I went into, and I would go into one in the morning, one in the afternoon. Next day, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. I would talk to people. I would feel out what they were doing. They would gauge their enthusiasm, their technical prowess. To my horror, I found that in every department there was a level of excellence and expertise that I would only expect in the great filmmaking capitals of the world. So having done this for 2 weeks, I was getting pretty despondent, but I still had a couple of get-outs. I went to watch Peter Jackson starting to direct. So how does he handle his crew? How does he handle all those questions? How does he handle his actors? And what I saw was a master at work. And not only did I have a 180-degree change of attitude, I think I can claim to be one of the first people who was able to stand up in public and say, "You have no idea what's going on here. This is going to change the way films are made. This is going to be one of the most exceptional films or series of films of all time." And it was.
Great story. What would you say is your favorite character you ever played so far? Gimli, Salah, or other one?
My favorite character and my favorite film is the next one.
Will that next one be one of the Hobbit trilogy?
Unfortunately not, I don't think so. I have groveled enough. I said no very early on, because it was going to be made about 2 years after we brought out Lord of the Rings. But there were delays and delays, and the technology advanced. And so I was quite mortified when I went down there the other day to the studio last year and saw the 13 dwarves together. They didn't have half as much makeup on as I had, which is probably just as well, because mine took for hours and hours and hours to put on.
You even got an allergic reaction or something like that to the makeup?
No, it wasn't an allergic reaction. It was simply that we were using medical adhesive because it's the best adhesive. But the skin under your eyes is about the thickness of 2 cigarette papers. And it's very thin. And medical adhesive isn't designed to be put on and taken off, put on, taken off on a daily basis. And basically, it just removed the top layer of skin all around my eyes. And not only was it hideous, it was unpleasant and unbearable. And it really became a bit of a nightmare as well. But so sadly, I'm not in The Hobbit. But I have dropped enough hints.
Of course. Just to wrap it up, last 2 questions. What would you say was your reaction when you heard, well, we're doing another Indiana Jones movie on The Last Crusade, and we're getting an iconic film icon like Sean Connery on board?
Well, it's a brilliant idea, isn't it? It fleshes out Indiana Jones, and it throws so many lights on how the character develops, even to Salah's surprise. "You are named after the dog?" I think it was wonderful, and watching the chemistry of the 2 of them together was particularly interesting, because you'd have thought, these are 2 alpha males here. How are they going to get on? In fact, the way they got on was not only a tribute to themselves as stars of first magnitude, but it was also a tribute to them as men, because they worked together admirably in every sense, and it should be a tribute to both of them that they did that. And I think it's a wonderful film.
And just to finish, a fan sent us a question. He wants to know which one is your favorite Salah and Gimli moment, and quote.
Oh, my favorite Salah thing is probably that look and expression on my face when I realize that she has been kidnapped. I'm ready to fight, I turn around and she's gone. And that, and that terrible sense of having let them down as well, having let Indy down. Any scene with Karen Allen in is a favorite of mine on any picture. Gimli, well, Gimli is such a wonderful character. There are lots of, I love the sort of myopic sort of, the sense of self-importance that Gimli has. Gimli is funny because he doesn't realize he's small, he's a giant as far as he's concerned. But I think perhaps that terrible moment where he realizes that the gulf that he has to travel is bigger than he can jump, and he has to shamefully say, "Toss me." What? Toss me. And then, almost trying not to smile, Strider grabs him, and he says, "Don't tell the elf." The fact that he's just about to die by being thrown into a battle with hundreds of people, that doesn't worry him. It's fine. But the social embarrassment of having to admit to the elf that he allowed himself to be tossed, I think that's wonderful.
It's like in the Return of the King when Orlando Bloom kills the elephant. He says, "That counts for one."
Well, you see, the trouble with your pointy ears, he cheats all the time. Anyone can do that all the time, But for real wet work, you should use an axe. You see, what I like to do is I like to get them behind the knees with the first blow. They're not expecting it there. It drops them down on the floor, and then you can hit them in the head a few times with the old axe and scramble the brains a bit. For wet work, for serious wet work, use an axe.
That was a perfect ending for this interview, seriously. Thanks so much for this. It's a dream come true, and it's a very honor to meet you, John. Thanks so much.
It's a great pleasure and honor to meet you. And guys, I beg you, go out and buy this Blu-ray. Even for me, an old technological dud notices the difference. It's an extraordinary way of seeing one of the great films of all time. Take care.